welcome. It's Chris from Christopher Hall Training, and welcome to this week's whiteboard, where we're going to be talking about lordosis treatment, and we're going to be focusing on one of the 4 best stretches. Now, when I talk about one of the 4 best stretches, what I've done is I've put together what I consider to be 4 of the best stretches for lordosis, for the main reason that they target the main muscles involved within lordosis. Now, if you want to come and find that, it's a free downloadable guide. You can just follow this link here. It will take you straight to the page. You just enter your name and email address. It will download straight into your inbox. And then what you can do is start using that as a mini workout. You can use it as a mini workout to loosen off those main muscles. They'll start to relax. And what it will give you is the opportunity to flatten and reduce that excessive curvature in your lumbar spine. It'll make the hips a little bit more flexible, and it'll allow the pelvis to have a little bit more movement as well. So with regards to this tutorial, what we're going to be focusing on is one of those 4 stretches, and we're going to be looking at the Psoas stretch. Now, we are looking to understand how to perform this stretch correctly. So we're going to cover 3 main points throughout it. First of all, we're going to look at the teaching points, then we're going to look at potential technique flaws, then we're going to look at how to progress the stretch and extend how to make that muscle a little bit more flexible. Main reason I'm putting this together is because when I'm working with people or when I'm in and around the gym observing people, what I see is a lot of these technique flaws being used or being demonstrated, and they're trying to obviously make that muscle a little bit more flexible and stretch that muscle, but because of these technique flaws, yes, they're in a similar position, but it's not necessarily getting the full effect that they could get. So we're going to talk about those and how you can overcome them. But what we're going to talk about first are the teaching points. Before we get into that, I just quickly want to mention my social media platforms. So if you want to come along to Twitter, it's at Christopher Hall. Facebook is Christopher Hall Training, and Instagram is Christopher Hall. Please do come along there, like and follow. I'm sharing information like this weekly, if not daily, trying to help you upskill yourself in your health and fitness. Alternatively, as I've mentioned, you can come to this link here and you can get the best stretches for lordosis free guide to help you with your stretching. But for now, what we're going to do in the next slide is talk about the teaching points. Before we get into the teaching points, I just quickly want to mention the psoas muscle, because if it's the psoas muscle we're trying to stretch, we need to have a basic understanding of that muscle. So what we've got is it joins on each of the lumbar vertebrae, so you can see here, even up into T12, but it goes from all of the lumbar vertebrae down through the pelvis, and it joins onto the inside at the top of your leg. Now, this bone here is called the femur, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So with the understanding that it starts on the lumbar spine and it finishes on the top and the inside of the femur, when we want to stretch that muscle, all we need to do is basically pull this end away from this end, and that will stretch the muscle. So at a very, very basic level, when you want to stretch a muscle, any muscle, you just need to pull its start away from its end, or its origin away from its insertion. So what we want to be focusing on is lengthening this area of the body. And how we do that is using this psoas stretch here. So the teaching points are, we start on one knee, our body is tall, and we need to first of all start to flatten the spine. Now, it's not going to be completely flat if you've got an excessive curvature, but we want to start flattening it. So we want to engage the tummy muscle. So pull the tummy in tight, and that will start to flatten that area of the spine. But we want to keep that body tall. What we then do is we lean forward onto the front leg. So as you can see here, what I'm starting to do is lean forward. That knee is starting to go forward over the toes, and the hip is starting to come forward. So as I'm doing this, what's happening is I'm pulling this end away from this start, if you will, or this insertion away from this origin. What I then do is hip extends of the back leg. So as I start to lean forward, the hip extends of the back leg. What we then want to be able to do is maintain a flattened lumbar curve. So as we did at the start, we will probably need to pull our tummy in a little bit tighter to try and maintain that flattened curve. But as we start going forward, maintain the flattened lumbar curve. Then we want to hold and then repeat on the other leg. Now, to start with, just hold for 20 seconds and then release the stretch and then go on to the other leg. That's completely ample to start with, and then we can start progressing that later on. But just start with 20 seconds. So it's quite a simple stretch, but it does need to have a little bit of concentration, a little bit of focus when we're doing it. Now, if you're unbalanced in this position, you can just use something on the outside of this front leg just to put just to rest your hand on. So it could be a sofa, a table, a chair, could be a foam roller if you're in the gym, or whatever it might be. But just to keep your balance doing that. So those are the teaching points. Now, when I talk about the teaching points, it all sounds quite simple, but what we're now going to do is talk about some of the technique flaws that you need to be aware of, whether you're doing them or not. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. I tend to find there are 3 sort of basic technique flaws that people need to focus on when they're doing this stretch to be able to maintain those teaching points that we talked about in the first slide. Now, what happens is they extend the hip, but they hyperextend the spine at the same time. So as I mentioned, when we lean forward on this front knee and start to extend and make a bigger curve here, what tends to happen is people will arch their back as well. So that's known as a hyperextended spine, or certainly lumbar spine. So their belly might stick out, their chest and their head might point upwards a little bit more. But what we need to maintain, as I mentioned, is that flattened lumbar curve and pulling that tummy in tight. And what that will do, that will keep this start moving away from this end as we extend. Because what it will do is it will create more of an arch. If we hyperextend the spine, that start will get closer to that end, or the origin will become closer to the insertion, if you can picture that. So our focus is to maintain that flattened lumbar curvature or curve as we go forward on the knee, because we want to try and avoid it as we extend at the hip, but hyperextending of the spine. Now, the second one is the femur externally rotates. So I mentioned before that this here is the femur. Now, if it was to externally rotate, my foot would start to move around here. So it would start to move behind my buttocks a little bit more. Now, again, what's happening here is because the muscle's tight, it's starting to pull my body where it wants it to go. Now, if we can avoid that external rotation and just have a straight line from here down to here, then it's going to be much easier to be able to get much more of a stretch from it. So we want to try and avoid and just keep a straight line from sort of down through. If you were looking at me straight on, you wouldn't be able to see, you would only see my femur down here if you were looking at me straight on. If I was, again, straight on, but externally rotated, you would begin to see the foot point inwards. And that's something that we want to avoid. So we just want to try and keep that straight line through the hip. And the third thing is the pelvis opens. Now, what this means is basically, you can see I'm slightly diagonal to the picture here. But what would happen is if my pelvis would open, my body would start to rotate towards my back leg. So I would start to face the camera. Now, that's something, again, that we want to avoid. We want to try and keep nice straight lines. So we've got this leg pointing forward. We've got this leg, the pelvis at a right angle to it. And then this leg pointing straight backwards. If we can do that, we're going to get much more from the stretch. So these are the 3 things that we want to be trying to avoid when we're doing the psoas stretch. Finally, we're talking about the progressions. So if you are in this position and your technique's good, we're overcoming some of the technique flaws that we talked about in the last slide, what we can start to do is we can start looking at these 4 points to try and progress the stretch. Now, I'd probably recommend doing these after increasing the time up to anywhere in the region of about a minute. So go from that 20-second start and just progress up to a minute. And then you want to start thinking about some of these. So if you want to include the rectus femoris muscle, which is a muscle that goes from the pelvis here down all the way down the leg onto the front of the knee, you can lift your back foot. So if you just lift this back foot from the floor, obviously prop it on a sofa or a chair or hook it up with a resistance band or something like that, what you'll then start to do is start working a muscle that is another muscle affected by lordosis, which is the rectus femoris rectus femoris muscle. So you can do that by lifting the back foot. Now you can also include the adductors by moving the front knee out. So that just means pushing this knee out towards the outside of the foot, and that will start getting the adductors on the inside of this leg. So you're doing the psoas. If you're then lifting the back leg, you're getting the rectus femoris here, and you're getting the adductors over here. Now, it's important when you start to include these additional bits that you maintain all the teaching points that we talked about before. So we've got straight line here. Yes, this leg will be slightly different, but this leg is pointing straight backwards. That's another thing that we want to be focusing on. So it's not just about lifting the leg, it's about lifting and maintaining the position from those teaching points. So those 6 teaching points that we talked about at the start, they are the foundation. The next one is we can internally rotate our femur. So where in the last one I talked about externally rotating, which shortens the gap between origin and insertion. If we internally rotate it, which means bringing my foot here, sort of out here somewhere, what that will do, that will pull this insertion point here away from the origin point here. So if we've got a flattened lumbar curvature that we've already talked about and an internally rotated femur, it's going to lengthen that muscle ever so slightly more. So it's going to aid with the extra stretch of the muscle. And then finally is rotate the torso towards the back leg. Now, in the last slide, I talked about the pelvis opening and the pelvis rotating. When we rotate the torso, we want to keep the pelvis here pointing forward. So we want to keep that level and at a right angle to this front leg. But what we can do is we can start to rotate the torso towards the camera. Now, when we rotate the torso towards the camera, it rotates these vertebrae as well. And these vertebrae, again, the origin will move away a bit further from the insertion point down here. So when we're talking about these progressions, there are 4 of them, but it's making sure you're doing just one at a time and just making sure you're getting the most from them whilst you're doing them. Don't just try and throw in all of these at once, because there's a good chance you won't maximize all of them. So just focus on, if you want to include the rectus femoris, just do that one. If you want to include the adductors, just do that one. If you want to internally rotate the femur, just do that one to start with. Once you've got that one mastered, you can start to rotate the torso towards the back leg, and then that will increase the stretch that little bit further. So hopefully that's given you a better understanding of the psoas stretch. Hopefully it's given you a better understanding of how to perform the stretch correctly, some of the technique flaws that you want to be focusing on whilst you're doing it, and how to progress the stretch. Now, if you want more of the stretches, you can just come straight to this link. Again, it's in the description below. You can download the free guide and you can start doing all the stretches, the 4 stretches that are within it. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris from Christopher Holt Training. I'll speak to you in the next video.